when I first got saved in the Methodist Church, it felt a little awkward because I didn't know the lingo. Okay, so we did the Lord's Prayer every Sunday, and I had never heard that in my entire life. So usually, as people were praying the Lord's Prayer, I was sitting there going, right? Just moving their lips. Nobody knows they know, okay? So finally, one Sunday, of course, the doxology that we do after the offering was the same way. I just kind of mumbled my way through it for a while. And so I remember clearly one Sunday, Molly, who was a year younger than me, was the pastor's daughter, she leaned over and she elbowed me. She says, "Hey, you know that's in the bulletin, right?" Oh, nobody ever told me, right? So the other thing I remember clearly is it was very difficult to worship because, for better or for worse, my generation, we do not really know the hymns. It's not what we're familiar with. We know them because when we went to church with our grandparents as a kid, we know their church sang them. But for us, it's not something we hear regularly on the radio or anything like that, and so they're not familiar to us. So it was really hard to get into worship for me at first. And so luckily, I had a friend whose mom totally picked up on this because he was about my age. And so she started taking us every Saturday. We'd go out to a church over in South Bend. We'd drive an hour out to South Bend to go and worship this church on Saturday nights because they had like the full band and, you know, like full media experience. It was cool. And so every Saturday she'd offer to take us out there because she wanted us to be able to worship. She knew that not everybody worships the same way. And there's nothing wrong with that. But we ought to facilitate and make sure that everyone gets a chance to worship in a way that they feel fit. And so our story today is exactly that happening. Jesus comes into the temple and there are people making worship difficult. And so when he comes in, and it's easy to miss here without knowing the background, because it says, in the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. Okay, so, first of all, this kind of makes sense that there would be people selling all these animals. Okay, because in that time, you had to come and bring a literal animal to the altar and sacrifice it on the altar. Okay, so it kind of makes sense that for the convenience of people, they would just have them readily available, right? Because this is during Passover. This isn't just a regular week. Okay, this is Passover. So at Passover, you have people coming. I mean, I'm talking like 100,000 people coming to the temple at Passover to come and present their offerings. And so, of course, if you have to travel a really long way, you're not going to bring your sheep and your goats and your cows with you. So you would come and you would purchase some in the city, okay, because they had to be specific. They had to be without blemish and perfect, and they'd be great. And so you would come into the city, you would purchase some before you would go to the altar. And so the problem we're having here is twofold. First of all, what would happen, okay, you would have a cow. Let's say the cow is worth $100, okay? So you'd have a cow that in your home would be worth $100. You would come to the temple, they'd sell it to you for $300. Because they knew that you would come a long way and you needed to give an offering, so you'd pay anything to make it happen. So you have these people taking advantage of God's people. They're making it harder for God's people to worship. But the second thing, it says that they were set up in the temple courts. Okay, so to get this, you have to kind of know a little bit of background. The way the temple was set up was that there was kind of an outer court where the Gentiles were allowed to come to worship. Okay, so if you weren't Jewish, there was a specific part of the temple you could come to and give sacrifices to God. And then, if you were Jewish, there was another part, like the inner side, you could go to. And then, if you were like this special, like priestly group, there was a special section in the temple called the Holy of Holies, where there was a curtain that was like literally 6 feet thick. Okay, there's a giant curtain, and God's presence rested inside that little room. Okay, and so once a year, when the priest would go in to give sacrifices, the tradition was that they would tie a rope to their leg. Okay, they tie a rope to their leg with bells on it. And when they would go in, okay, because when you went in, you would be holy. So if they went in and they weren't holy, they were just struck down. Boom. So if they pull it, the rope was still moving, they knew the priest was all right, okay? But if it wasn't, they'd pull it back out. Okay, that's how serious the temple was. Okay, that's how serious it was. But here's the thing: these guys that were taking advantage of people, they were set up with all these animals inside the temple courts, inside where the Gentiles were supposed to be able to worship. They were taking the space that was making God's place, what he calls later on, because Jesus does this twice, he says later, house of prayer. Okay? In the Old Testament, that part was supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations. And so the problem here is not necessarily that these people are selling and buying. The problem is they're doing it and taking advantage of people, and they're preventing the Gentiles from worshiping. They're in the space. They're invading somebody else's space. They're somewhere they're not supposed to be. And so as I thought about that this week, I got to thinking about all the ways that we prevent people from worshiping. All the ways, not necessarily that we prevent them from, we don't do it intentionally, but all the ways that we make it difficult for other people to worship. Because sometimes it's as simple as not knowing the liturgy. And other times we go much more obstructive about it and say, well, no, we have to do it this way. This is the way we do it here. We have to do it this way. And so Jesus gets really frustrated with these people. And it says he made a whip out of cords. Now, keep in mind, when it says he made a whip, it's not like there's just like random pieces of rope lying around. Okay? He's probably like grabbing like giant leaves and pieces of stuff. And he's making this whip. And it doesn't even say that he, specifically, I want to point out, it does not say he whipped people. Okay? Jesus did not get that violent. Okay? What it says is he used it to drive all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. Okay? So what he's doing here is he's clearing out the mess. He's clearing out all of these sacrificial animals. He says, get these out of here. He says, this is not where these belong. This is supposed to be a place of worship. And he says, get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market. So they had brought in these obstructions, and Jesus was clearing them all out. And it says the disciples remembered from the Old Testament, zeal for your house will consume me. Zeal will consume me. This idea that it's supposed to be a holy place, a place where people can come to worship from all nations, okay? Because the other thing he turned over was the money-changing tables. Okay? And this is the same thing in our current time. If you go to another country, they don't use dollars, okay? When I go to Uganda, they use Ugandan shillings. Okay? And the interesting thing about exchange rates is that they change all the time. And so in Uganda, when you go, there's one specific bank that you go to. You can go to a bunch of different places to exchange your money. But there's one bank that we always go to, and here's why. It's the bank that actually gives you a fair deal. Because everyone else you go to exchange money will give you way less. And so the same thing is happening here. He's turning over these tables, this zeal for God's house. Because in the temple there was a specific money you had to use. You couldn't just bring in any of your foreign currency to turn in. You had to exchange it for the temple currency. And so these guys were taking advantage. Instead of giving them a fair trade, they were making up to 300% profit by exchanging this money at the temple. And so it says, zeal for his house. He's so consumed with the idea that God's house ought to be a place of worship for everyone. He comes in and makes a whip and he drives them out. And so the Jews, of course, get a little upset about this because, let's be honest, they're probably used to this. I highly doubt this was the first time these people showed up at the temple. And so they get upset. They say, well, what sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this? It's kind of this like, what gives you the right? What gives you the right to come in and bust up what we've already had going on? Because let's be honest, if those guys were in there, and they probably weren't supposed to be in there, you gotta know somebody else is making a profit off of that. And so he says, what gives you the authority? And Jesus says, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. And of course, they have no clue what he's talking about here. So they're like, what? They're thinking this physical big temple, right? They're like, took 46 years to build this thing. You are not going to destroy it and build it in 3 days. That's just not going to happen. And it even admits, I love this, he admits, he says, after he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. So even in that moment, his disciples, they had no clue. They're like, what is this guy talking about? He's destroying the temple? What does that even mean? It says, after he has raised from the dead, then they realized what he meant. He meant that the temple is no longer just this building. The temple is no longer this space you have to come to worship God. He says the temple is Christ. And so when we look at this story and we ask ourselves, okay, how does this apply to us? Right? Because we can't just read it and say, okay, that sounds great. Okay, here's what I want to propose to you this morning. Okay, the temple, when Jesus died on the cross, it says that curtain, Okay, that curtain that 6 foot thick curtain that God's Spirit was behind, it says that curtain tore. Okay, just ripped right in the middle. Boom. Gone. God's Spirit. You get this kind of picture of you're on a balloon burst and the water just goes everywhere. And so you get this idea of God just flooding the area everywhere. God is going everywhere. And so when Jesus talks about himself as the temple, and when we talk about preventing people, what we got to ask is, what are we doing to ensure that everyone we know can know Jesus? Or even more importantly, and for most of us, the better question, what things are we doing that are preventing people in our lives from coming to know Jesus? Because as much good as we want to do, we fail. We fail a lot. We do a lot of things that we regret afterwards. We make decisions, we say things that we shouldn't have said, we do things we shouldn't have done. And what happens is that the people around us who don't know Jesus, they get a little squirmy. Because they say, well, I know such and such, and they're a Christian. They say they follow Jesus, but they also do this, and this. And I'm sure that any of us, if we think about our lives, we can think of what that list is. Okay, we know what that list is. They're like, yep, I do this, and I do this, and I do this. So if Jesus is going to get frustrated, okay, and he doesn't do that very often. Okay, he does not get mad very often in the Gospels. So if this is something Jesus is going to be mad and upset about, this is something we ought to be upset about in our lives. We ought to be upset about the fact that we do and say things that actually hinder the gospel. We ought to be upset about the fact that there are parts of our lives that when people look at it, they think, I don't want anything to do with Jesus. If that's what being a Christian looks like, I'm good. And so here's the great part this morning. Here's the good news. Okay? Because that's bad news. Bad news is we're really terrible at being Christians. Okay? One of my quotes I've been tossing around a lot lately was from Gandhi. He said, I like their Christ, I don't like their Christians. So that's the bad news. The bad news is we're not very good at being Christians. We're not very good at following Jesus with all of our hearts, with doing what we should do, saying the things we should say. The good news is this. The good news is that we have Jesus. That the whole point of the gospel is fresh start. That we don't have to go to the temple every year at Passover and give our offerings. We don't have to raise animals so that we can give them to God. We have Jesus. And because we are Christians, because we know Jesus, we can come before him and say, I messed up. And for most of us, that prayer goes like this. This is how it goes for me. I did it again. I did it again, God. We get to come before him and say, I did it again. And you know what he does? He forgives us. He does the most Jesus-like thing he could ever do, and he forgives us. And that's why on the first Sunday of every month, we celebrate communion. Okay? And I say we celebrate because it is kind of a somber thing, because we are remembering that Jesus died for us. But we celebrate communion because the purpose that was accomplished in communion is oh so sweet. Because in communion, Christ gave himself for us. So that when we do come to him and say, man, I did it again, we get to start over. We get to start over. And so when we remember communion, what we're really remembering is a fresh start. We're remembering that no matter how many times we have messed it up, we get to start over. We get to do better. We get to try better. He gets to give us life anew again. And so that's what we're going to do this morning. We're going to celebrate communion. Okay, and we're Methodists, so you know what that means. That means that as long as you know Jesus, or, more importantly, if you want to know Jesus, we invite you to come have communion with us. Because we are all children of God. We are all people who, again and again, go to God and say, God, I messed it up again. And so we get to celebrate together in communion. And so I'm going to pray. And then what I want us to do is we're going to celebrate communion together. Okay? I want to explain it a little bit after I pray. We're going to do communion, and we're going to sing. But really what's most important is I want you to spend time in prayer this morning and say, God, where have I messed it up? Where have I not been a good example? Where have I prevented others from coming to know you? Because I have said that I know you, and I've done the wrong things. and pray that God would speak to you this morning on those things. Let's pray. Oh God, we are so thankful that you do come in and clear us out when we need it. And so God, we come to you this morning asking you to do that in us. Asking you to clean up our act, to make us fresh and new again. God, we admit our faults. We admit where we've gone wrong. And we just ask for your forgiveness. God, let us start new today so that we would not be a hindrance to someone else. So that your house would be a house of prayer for all nations and not just us. So be with us this week. Bless this communion. Let it remind us of the work you have done for us in Jesus' name. Amen.